Scott, he used to be a Mormon. I could say a lot about him for a long time, but the bottom line is I've heard his story. This is a good story, and you want to hear it. And I'll tell you why, is because it's about coming out of a community of faith and how hard it is and what the battles are. And they come up in places where you didn't think they were going to be. So, Scott, why don't you come up and tell us your story?
Well, I appreciate being asked to come and speak today. It's probably about 4 or 5 years ago I started giving presentations about my time as a Mormon, first for the Winnipeg Skeptics, which is a local group, and I started giving presentations there. And then with the previous incarnation of this group with the Humanist Association in Manitoba, I give presentations, and it's just my story of me becoming a Mormon and then eventually leaving Mormonism, and that's why this talk is called "Why I Joined and Then Left the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints," aka Mormons. So, and mostly I'll use the term Mormon just for the shorthand, though the actual name of the church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I'll leave some time for questions at the end. So this is just a personal story, and I don't know, see if you like it. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about my background and some of the circumstances that led to me joining the church. And the doctrines that appealed to me, that's why I call this talk Doctrine In, Doctrine Out, because doctrine is why I joined it, or very heavily influenced why I joined it, and then also eventually why I left. Some of the spiritual experiences I had, and as any religious person or former religious person might be able to tell you, there's very rich spiritual experiences when you're in that community. The feelings of the Holy Spirit coming over you. And I had that in abundance. Well, I'm getting the chills just talking about it right now. And then I'm going to talk about why I left. That sums it up. What I'm not going to talk about is I'm not going to talk about doctrines that aren't really applicable to my story. So things about temples, secret handshakes. You might have heard about stuff like this, or the magic underwear. That's not really part of my story, but if you want to ask questions, all right. Because any of these things can be found on Wikipedia or an afternoon on YouTube. You can find out about all the funny doctrines that Mormons believe. There's plenty. There's no way I could cover it in one talk, all the quirky little things that exist. And so I'm not really going to talk about that. It's more about, like I said, it's more about my story. I'm not going to be bashing religion or bashing the church. I'm just going to be talking about the real things that were an influence on me wanting to get out. All right, so a couple terms, just so you know. Award. Can everybody hear my mic if I'm over here? It is this one, right? Okay, I'm just making sure. I like to walk around a little bit. Award is just a local congregation at a building. That's what a ward is. So I'll probably say that a few times. It's usually up to about 150 people in a ward, and then when there's more than that coming to a local church, they'll split it and make another one. A stake president is someone, and bishop are leaderships in the church. Stake president is kind of the highest one in the local area, say for Winnipeg and Manitoba, and a bishop would be the person in charge of a ward. So there'll be a lot of bishops, but only one stake president. Because in case these will come up. LDS, Mormon, Latter-day Saint, these terms are interchangeable. And the word of wisdom, which will come up later, is the Mormon Health Code, which is where we don't drink alcohol, coffee, or tea, use tobacco, or any illicit drugs. That's what the word of wisdom is. And if you're a good believing Mormon, you follow that word of wisdom. You know that you're ready to leave the church when you want to have a sip of tea. Then you know it's all downhill from there. The Book of Mormon is scripture that Mormons have in addition to the Bible, and I'll get a little bit more into that later on. It's not a replacement for the Bible, but it's additional scripture that Mormons hold in very high regard. And TBM means true believing Mormon. That's someone who believes it with all their heart, believes everything that's said, and lives it truly. I was a TBM at one point. I believed it all. I lived it sincerely. I wasn't just doing it for show or because of social pressure. I believed it and was sincere. And all right, good. An investigator is a non-member who's learning about the church. That's what they call it. I'm not using that. A non-member learning about the church. So I was an investigator, then I became a member. And callings, this is the last one. Callings are duties appointed by God through revelation. So the bishop would come to me and say, Brother Carnegie, we're calling you to be the elders quorum president. I'd say, okay, bishop. And so then it's all a volunteer church. So a calling is something you're asked to, a service you're asked to perform in the local church. So it could be Sunday school teacher, it could be choir leader. All of those things were called callings, and they were duties appointed through revelation, supposedly, that you were asked to do. Okay, so in brief, a little bit about my background, which will relate to the later story. I grew up as a Catholic. I kind of left the Catholic Church when I was about 12. I stopped going to church, but I was still interested in religion. I just found it fascinating to know why people believed, what they believed and why they believed it. I was always interested in that, even once I stopped going to Catholic Church. In fact, when I was 12 years old, I asked my local priest about becoming a priest. I said, what does it take to become a priest? He said, well, he told me some things, and you have no possessions. And I thought, I just started playing guitar. I thought, I'm not selling my guitar. I know it, but I was 12. It was shallow, but that actually made me think, I don't want to be a priest if I have to give up my guitar. I converted to Mormonism when I was 21 years old. And I stopped attending when I was 32. So I was active, faithful Mormon for 11 years. And during those last, probably the last 4 or 5 months is when I really started downing. But otherwise, that whole time, I went to church every week. I ended up going to the temple. I was a true believing Mormon. I wasn't just faking it. I officially resigned in 2012. So even though I stopped attending, I'm 42 now, so I stopped attending 10 years ago. I waited. My wife didn't want me to officially resign at the time, just in case, she said. So I didn't. I waited after we split up, and then I was like, well, there's no reason to stay Mormon anymore. I was already out as an atheist at that point, so there's really no point to staying on paper. When I was a Mormon, like I said, I was fully active and faithful. I was a true believing Mormon. When I was asked to serve in a calling, I always said yes. I never said no. I was there every Sunday. If you weren't there on a Sunday, you got phone calls. Brother Carnegie, are you ill? Are you okay? Because they're checking up. It's a very inclusive, supportive religion, and that's something that was very appealing to me. And temple endowed, which means that I went to the temple and I went through a ceremony called the endowment. Again, these are one of these things you can Google. It's the one where you get the magic underwear and you learn the secret handshakes. That's the endowment. And so you have to be a special kind of Mormon to get endowed. You have to have an interview with the bishop and the stake president, and then make sure you're following all the rules, and that you're faithful, and you pay your tithing, all these things. Then you get to go to the temple, and then that. I was sealed to my spouse. What that means is I wasn't only married here on earth. Whoa. I had a celestial marriage. I was married up in heaven forever and ever and ever into eternity. That's what being sealed to my spouse means. And that happens in the temple. You have to be able to go to the temple to get sealed. So actually, if you get divorced, you have to get divorced twice. So when I left the church, when I officially resigned, my sealing to my spouse was canceled, though I was still married technically according to the government. So they're almost separate paths. You can be divorced legally, but still married, still sealed to a spouse. It gets very confusing. I was a Sunday school teacher. I was a clerk. I did missionary work. And I was an elder in the Melchizedek priesthood. That's the highest level of priesthood I attained. What that means is most male members of the church hold some form of priesthood. You start when you're 12 years old. You hold something called the Aaronic priesthood, and then you step up and step up. So I was an elder in the Melchizedek priesthood. All right, so this is how I joined. This is why did I join this church? I was 21, I was a young man, I had long hair and tattoos, and why would I want to do this? Well, my auntie and uncle are members of the church, and they have children about my age, and a woman broke my heart, and I wasn't feeling very good, I know, aw. And I asked my cousins if they would take me to church with them. I just thought I would feel better. Because I still had a belief. I still had a spiritual sort of sense to things where I felt uplifted through spiritual things. I would listen to a John Lennon song and I would feel uplifted. I thought if I go to church, I'll feel uplifted. And the teachings appealed to me, and I'll go through what they were. Some of them appealed to me. And I met with the missionaries. So I was an investigator. You're like fresh meat. When they see a new face walk into the ward, they're like, that guy. And they run over, introduce themselves, and they want to set up a time to meet with you and teach you the discussions. At the time, there were 6 formal discussions where you'd learn about the church, and then they would commit you to baptism after only the 2nd discussion. Like, come on. And they wouldn't give you more discussions unless you committed to baptism. Anyways, these are missionaries, right? You've seen these guys. Now, when I say that I did missionary work, I didn't actually do this, because this is fellows that are younger, like 18, 19, 20 years old. I was 21 when I converted, so I was already kind of past the age for missionary work. But what I did was I went out with these guys as just a lay member to people's houses to discuss the gospel and things like that, because I enjoyed doing missionary work. I like proselytizing. I'm proselytizing right now, kind of, in a certain sense. This is me with the missionaries that taught me. Actually, I had sister missionaries, Sister DeForest and Sister Jennings. And they're not supposed to be that close to me, technically. Like, you're supposed to be arm's length away, but they were kind of breaking the rules. Anyways, that was me in 1994, just as I think I had just got baptized at that point. So here's some of the teachings that I liked, that appealed to me. Baptism wasn't at birth. It was at 8 years old, after you kind of understood somewhat about the world, I suppose. You had some sense of choice. So baptism was at 8 years old. It wasn't when you were a baby. There's no hell in Mormonism. There's 3 heavens and something called outer darkness. And no one really goes to outer darkness. That's like the worst. That's like the demons. Transcoda. Jeff said that, not me. You might be sent out to outer darkness, Jeff. But there really wasn't a hell per se. Proxy baptism, I thought this was so neat. Someone learns the gospel or can't learn the gospel because maybe they died without ever hearing it. And then when I grew up as a Catholic, I was taught that those people were lost, that they were in, I forget the term, purgatory, right? That's been rescinded since now. But at the time, it was, you were in purgatory, you were lost. But with proxy baptism, someone could be baptized in your place after you died. And I did this. at the temple. I baptized people, full immersion, and we'd say, Sister blah, 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 I baptize you in the name of Jim Jones, who is dead. Dunk, right? That's a proxy baptism. And then the idea is that person up in heaven could choose to accept that baptism or not. But because baptism is an earthly thing, you need to have a physical body to be baptized, has to be done. So that is some of the similarities between Catholicism and Mormonism, is that there's sacraments that have to be done in order to move along. And because I have that Catholic background, I guess some of it sort of appealed to me that way. The most important thing in the Mormon church is modern day revelation. That there is a prophet living today, that receives revelation directly from God to guide us. And when I heard this teaching, I thought, that is amazing. Because when I left the Catholic Church, and then when I investigated churches during those subsequent years, I didn't want to just join a church made up by a guy that's just like, hey, I like this part of the Bible, so we're going to handle snakes, and we're going to have a church all about this, or whatever it's going to be. That didn't interest me. So when I learned that their doctrine anyway said that they were led by modern day revelation by a prophet today, I thought, that's pretty important. I want to know more about that. Here's some teachings I didn't like. And some culture. Some teachings and culture are sort of mixed together, and it actually becomes quite relevant later on why I left this mixing of teachings and culture. There's no sex outside of marriage, and that sucks. Especially when you're 21 and you're not married. You know what I mean? I didn't like that. That took me some time to accept, but I accepted it. Who said that? I did. Until I got married, I didn't have sex for a long time. Anyways, there's no drinking alcohol. like I said, I liked alcohol, and that was actually harder to stop than sex, because alcohol is easier to get. You can just go buy a beer. So that took a little more effort. So I wasn't a fan of that. When I was taught that, or when they presented that teaching, not a fan. White shirts and ties. They have this obsession with wearing white shirts and ties in Mormonism. I didn't get it. I've always been a pretty informal kind of guy. Like I said, I had like long hair, I have tattoos, and I just, I was like, play rock and roll, not into that sort of thing. And you go there and everyone would be wearing suits and ties, and I'm just not a formal person, really. And so I found it kind of annoying because there was like an expectation where it was almost brought to the point of doctrine, when it's just a cultural thing. They don't wear white shirts and ties in Samoa when you go to church. They weren't wearing that. They were wearing different things. It's a cultural thing, but it's treated like doctrine. I didn't like that. Obedience to the prophet. Again, with the sort of nonconformity that I was into, there was a high obedience to the prophet, like what the prophet says goes. And even though I was a believer, I didn't believe everything the prophet said was doctrine or should be followed to the letter of the law. And I saw a lot of people did. I didn't like that, because I don't want to turn off my brain. I was sort of letting my brain be used by them, but I didn't want to totally turn it off. But I found this to be unappealing. Blacks could not have the priesthood until 1978 in the Mormon church. And as I learned later, it went a lot deeper than that. But that's the teaching I knew about early on that I didn't like. I mentioned about getting married in the temple or being sealed so that you're married forever and ever and ever. If you're not a member of the church, you can't go to those temple weddings. So I was a convert. None of my family were members. So my parents, if I got married in the temple, they would not have been able to go to my wedding. That sucks. That I told my mom, I remember telling my mom at one point that she wouldn't be able to go to my wedding. That's a crappy thing. No parent wants to hear that. And even though I tried to soften it, it wasn't because you're a bad mom or anything like that, but still, how do you feel when your kid tells you that you're not worthy enough to go to their wedding? Whether you mean it that way or not, that's how it can feel. So that obviously bothered me. And luckily, my parents were able to attend my wedding. I chose not to get married in the temple. I got married in a ward, and then a year later went to the temple and got sealed together. So some more things about what appealed to me. The Joseph Smith story, and briefly, this is the whole basis of where Mormonism came from, was there was this boy who was 14 years old who had a vision from God when he was praying and asking what church to join. And he said, and God appeared to him and said, don't join any of them. You're going to start your new one. It's going to be the restored church of God here on earth, and you're going to lead it. And that gave me tingles like crazy. Because again, I didn't want to just join a church made up by a guy. Ironically enough, it's just a church made up by a guy. But at the time, I was still pretty open to investigating that, right? So I found that very appealing. Again, I thought, and that goes back to the modern day revelation. If that's true, to me, that was important. If it's true, it's important to me to know if it's true. Wow, I had so many spiritual experiences. I'd be reading the scriptures, and they had a lot of books they'd give you when you're investigating about the church. And it would read about the history of the church, and I was reading, I was feeling all these tinglings, and just like when I hear Imagine by John Lennon, that same feeling, that warmth that comes over you, I was feeling that reading all these things, and the missionaries were telling me this was the Holy Ghost, confirming for me that what I was reading was true. So I believed it. I also had some bad spiritual experience with demons where I woke up and I was paralyzed and I felt demons trying to enter my body, and I would look around and I would see these figures. And this was at the same time I was investigating the church. So I talked to the missionaries about this, and they said, well, that's Satan trying to get you. So you better commit to baptism now. Because this is when I was kind of on the fence. I'm serious. I was on the fence about committing to baptism, and they said, that's Satan trying to get to you, so set a date for baptism, and I did. And, there was no malice in their heart. They believed it, the Mormons are so friendly and inviting. You walk into that building, and you're just accepted. And I grew up, I often felt like an outsider and not accepted by certain members of my family because I was kind of quirky or for whatever reason. I always kind of felt like a little bit of a black sheep. But when you walk in there and you're just accepted and people shake your hand and they see you and they want you to sit by them, wow, it feels great to just be accepted without any judgment. And that's what I felt. Fellowshipping was very good in the church, meaning if you needed help, people were there for you. When I needed to move from one apartment to another, there'd be one phone call and have a dozen guys there. The elders quorum, all the elders quorum guys would show up and help you move. That was one of the main things you did when you were an elder, is help people move. Really. But the fellowshipping was very good. You had a lot of support, and I'll go into more about some of those supports. So again, some of the value I felt by being a member of this church, what appealed to me. And again, the modern day revelation was very important to me, and I found that very appealing. I also enjoyed scholarship. See, in the Mormon church, Sunday school isn't just for the little kids. Adults go to Sunday school as well. And you read the Bible and you investigate it, and there's all these extra scholarly works. There's quite a large body of Mormon scholarship, and we would use that to enhance our understanding of the doctrine and the history of the church. I liked all of those things. I found that very appealing. It was nice to be in an environment where learning was encouraged, but only learning from official sources, though. That's right. Don't go on the internet, because then you leave the church. That's what happened to me. Okay. Another thing that appealed to me was it was a lay ministry. No one was paid. So at the local ward level, the bishop, the counselors, everyone, no one was paid. It was all a lay ministry. To me, it just made it feel more genuine. People weren't there just for a paycheck, I guess. That appealed to me. And a lay Sunday service. What I mean by that is, when you go to Mormon church, you don't stand up. There isn't like the bishop just up there standing giving a sermon. It's members of the congregation that would be asked. So, what's your name? Todd. All right. I'm the bishop. Brother Todd, next week, I want you to give a talk on charity, 20 minutes. And you say, yes, bishop.
Yes, Bishop. All right.
That's how it worked. It was a lay Sunday service. So you'd have usually 2 or 3 people speaking on different topics. I found it very relevant. It wasn't just, I will turn to second, da-da-da. It wasn't like that. I found that very appealing. Emotionally rich experiences, like those spiritual experiences I mentioned, the fellowshipping, all of that wrapped up into a very emotionally rich experience. Open mic night was great. Once a month, you'd have a testimony meeting. There would be no scheduled speakers. It was just like, all right, brothers and sisters, you do the sacrament. That would be done, the bread and water. Now it's just like you sit back and people just come up and bear their testimony. Oh, I loved it because it was always so genuine, on the fly, from the heart, and spiritual experiences like crazy, butterflies like crazy every time. And wow, I'm kind of missing it right now, talking about it, like just that feeling, that you get. Oh, wow. It's very powerful. And ironically, even though the word of wisdom, there were parts that were difficult that I didn't like, I also liked, though, that there was a high standard that set us apart. And so I guess it made me feel special when I'd be out with friends and I would say, no, I'm not going to have a beer. And, oh, come on, Scott. And no, it's just, I don't do that. And I didn't do that. And I didn't for that whole time. It made me feel special. Quick Mormonism 101. Like I mentioned, it was founded by Joseph Smith in 1830. He was directed to the golden plates by the angel Moroni, from which he translated the Book of Mormon. He was the first prophet. Okay, you understand this, like Mormon doctrine stuff. He was the first prophet after the apostasy. So meaning, in the early days, Jesus set up his church, but then all the prophets and apostles were killed off or died. There was no priesthood authority. It had to be restored. It couldn't just be started up again. It had to be restored direct from heaven. That's what Mormons believe about their church, that they are a restoration of the church, not a reformation. And it's built upon modern-day revelation and authority. Without this modern-day revelation and authority, there is no church. And the prophet today is Thomas S. Monson. So there is a fellow today who is the prophet. Here he is. Nice looking guy. So Mormons considered him the prophet, just like Moses or Noah. This guy receives revelation for the world direct from our Heavenly Father. I feel like I'm teaching the Sunday school right now. Now, in the church, some of the doctrine and teaching sources, it's not just the Bible. That's the thing that also I liked about it, was that whereas you might have a lot of religions have the Bible, and that's their only thing, right, to go off of. And then they'll have their own scholarship from there. But with Mormons, they have the Book of Mormon. They have the Doctrine and Covenants, which were modern-day direct revelations to Joseph Smith and all the subsequent prophets, like in the last 200 years. That's what the Doctrine and Covenants is. That's where the word of wisdom comes from. The Pearl of Great Price is another set of scriptures. There's a whole bunch of stars there because that becomes very important later on. It's almost 98% of why I left the church is the doctrine contained in the Pearl of Great Price. And you'll see why in a minute. The Holy Bible, as translated correctly though, always that caveat, because mistakes happen, right? And they use the King James Version. And there's a book series called The History of the Church. That is also where we got some of the doctrine from. That History of the Church series though is a bit of a, they want to ignore it kind of, because that's where you can go and read what the early prophets said, like about black people, and see that they're like, you know, there's some pretty racist and stuff in there. And I think they kind of like to ignore a lot of those things, but it's their own publication, and it was written down by scribes, and there's apologetics to explain away almost all of it. The church publication, so the church puts out a magazine, which will have the monthly message from the prophet, and General Conference, which is a meeting that happens twice a year, where the prophets and apostles will come and speak to the world, to the church, from Salt Lake City. And it's basically you just go to church and you watch the TV, and they tell you all the stuff you should know. What you should know to survive in the world right now. So, what Mormon life is like. Wow. Sunday church was 3 hours long. That's just if you go to regular church, never mind having different callings. And when I stopped going to church, I was going for 8 hours a day on Sundays because I had so many meetings to go to. But it's 3 hours long in 1 hour blocks. So first you have sacrament meeting, then you have an hour of Sunday school separated by age, and then an hour of Sunday school separated by sex. So men would go to elders quorum, women will go to relief society, and youth. So there's all these teachings going on, all these very, very busy. So that's just for church. There's so many meetings. The more callings you have, I think I have 3-4 meetings a week, because if you have a calling, you might have a meeting before church, then after church I did tithing. Like I was a ward clerk, so I'd count up tithing, so I had a meeting after church as well. It just never ends. Callings keep you very busy. That's part of the point, is what they say when you're joining the church. They say, give a person a friend and something to do, and that will keep them coming back. So you get a calling right away, and you're asked to, because then you feel committed, right? It's like, I'm teaching Sunday school, so I have a commitment to be there, so I'm going to go. It really makes a huge difference when you have a calling. And people that don't have, when people start, you notice that they're kind of, their faith may be wavering, you give them a calling. And that's how you get it back. Institute, every week. Institute was sort of for the adults, just scholarly Bible and Book of Mormon studies, where we get together on a Thursday night for like 3-4 hours and do this. So between church, different callings, institute, we were at the church building 4 times a week at least, depending on how many things you have going on. There's no time for anything else. And people have little kids. It's very busy. You can only date Mormons. I should say that's not a doctrine, that's a culture thing, right? But the social pressure is to only date Mormons. That's part of just Mormon life. And home teaching, again, so busy. Home teaching is when you're assigned families of people that are usually less active, like people don't really come to church anymore, but you want to meet with them to give them a spiritual message. So you're assigned. So me and Brother Joseph are assigned to go visit this family and this family and this family once a month. Usually you have 3 families once a month, and you go give a spiritual message. And I enjoyed it. I liked meeting with people. And you'd say, see how they're doing, or maybe, maybe there's some trouble in the home where someone lost a job, and then you'd go back to the bishop and say, you know what, Brother Smith has lost his job, and that's how you kind of keep tabs on people that aren't around so much, because they want to support them, like it's genuine, but also you're assigned, right? So this is Mormon life. This is how they keep you so busy you have no time for anything else. And then, like I mentioned at the end, I was at church for 8 hours by the time I stopped going to church, because I'd have meetings in the morning. Then I'd drive back home, get my wife and kids. We'd come back for church for 3 hours, then I'd drive them home. And then I'd come back to do tithing and have meetings with the bishop and the elders quorum. It's really busy. This is not why I left. I didn't want to sin. Oh, I hate it when people say that to me. Or they would, more specifically, they'd say to my wife, why isn't Scott coming to church? He must want to drink. He must want to da-da-da-da. I don't know anyone that's left the Mormon church because they wanted to have a beer. It wasn't working for me anymore, both socially and intellectually, and spiritually too. So I didn't leave because I wanted to sin. I just want to point that out. So here we go, why I left. Oh, modern day revelation, that thing keeps coming back. Things happened where if you don't believe in modern day revelation, that the church actually has it, then there's no foundation to believe anything in the church. It's either all true or all a lie. There's no gray with that. When someone stands there and says, I am the prophet of God, either they are or they are not. You know what I mean? As far as being a believer. And that's something that was preached to us as well. It's like you're in or you're out. It's very black and white. I was kind of a liberal Mormon, which means that I would drink Pepsi and some Mormons won't, because they think, because of the word of wisdom, because if you don't drink coffee or tea in the word of wisdom, so some Mormons think it must be because of caffeine. So they won't drink Pepsi, for example. But that's not a doctrine, that's a culture. I drank Pepsi, I was a liberal Mormon. Also, I didn't wear a white shirt. And I had long hair. So that made me a liberal Mormon. Like, that's how radical I was. DNA, what can I say? Evolution. All right. I wore jeans to General Conference. So I mentioned General Conference, which is when the prophet will give a broadcast and you go to the church building and watch it. And there was no church. You just show up, and you'd watch a big screen, and then you go home. And I didn't feel like wearing a suit to do that. So I just wore jeans. And people would look at me like, oh, Scott's wearing jeans. You know what I mean? Like, come on. Anyways, liberal Mormon. I did not believe the prophet was infallible. I knew he made mistakes. Now, it's not part of Mormon doctrine that the prophet is infallible. It's part of the culture. People treat them like they're infallible, like whatever they say is it. And I knew it wasn't true because I knew about the contradictions, because I read things. And so when this prophet said A and this prophet said B, well, which one's right? The Mormon culture says that whichever the most current prophet is, he's the right one. Even if he contradicts the previous one, the current one is right. So I knew they weren't infallible. I didn't treat them like they were infallible. These are some apologetics places that did scholarly research, the foundation for ancient, I can't remember all the things, fair farms. And that last one there is a Usenet site that I used to post on a lot. Because I liked scholarship, I would go on the net and I would talk about doctrine with people, a lot of people that were leaving the church or not members or hostile to the church. And I was an apologist, an amateur apologist. I did that for years. I go back sometimes, I look up what I wrote 10 years ago, and it's kind of funny. Because I was such a believer. And you can rationalize anything. I think we know that in this room, that you can rationalize almost anything. And I did it to a T. But so I was very immersed in the scholarly world of it because I wanted to know if what I believe is true and how do I know it's true. And for a long time, just having the tingly feelings that I thought were the Holy Ghost was good enough. That's all I needed to know something was true. White shirt comes back. It does. What happened? I'm going to tell you the spiral of how this all happened. Had a friend who she was commenting about one of our brethren, saying, brother so-and-so didn't wear a white shirt today. He should have been wearing a white shirt to provide an example to investigators coming to church. And I said, well, it's not that big of a deal. It's not like it's doctrine. Oh, yes, it is doctrine. No, it's not. Oh, yes, it is. So I said, I'll find out. Let me find the source for where this supposed white shirt doctrine exists. And I think if that person knew that this little conversation I had with her is what spiraled me down to leaving, I think it would make her very sad. So I've never told her. In my search for the white shirt doctrine, I found this website, New Order Mormon. And I'll just read, there's a part on there that says, New Order Mormons are those who no longer believe some or much of the dogma. So I considered myself a liberal Mormon. I didn't believe everything. So I thought maybe this is the place for me. I needed a place to go that was safe to discuss these issues. They have a bunch of forums. They have a support forum there. So I made a post on April 10th, 2005, was my first post to the New Order Mormon forum, and I was asking about the white shirt doctrine. I was looking for sources because I had a sincere belief. I want to know where it came from. And I also, in that post, it's still there. I was looking at it last night. It was so neat. I was upset with people mixing doctrine and culture, and I was sort of venting about it a little bit, I guess. I mean, it's not like I went from just like everything's happy and then overnight. I had issues already kind of in the back of my head, and this felt like the place to go and discuss them. So I let it out. I mentioned how I saw no revelation locally. What I mean by that is, I was in the bishopric. I was a clerk, which means that there's the bishop, his two counselors, and me. And we're the ones that give callings. Not me. I would go and say, I'm kind of like a junior member, I guess, let's say. We would all pray together and say, okay, Sister blank should be called to be the Sunday school teacher. So we would call her and she would say no. And I couldn't believe it. I had never thought that would happen. Because if a calling is from God, how can you say no to God? And so we would pray again. Okay, well, let's find someone else. Okay, Sister so-and-so, will you be the Sunday school teacher? No, it happened again. It happened. It really destroyed my faith that there was revelation coming to us about who to call to be a Sunday school teacher. And this is specifically what happened. There was a Sunday school teaching calling we were trying to fill. I couldn't believe it. It was affecting me because if this is truly revelation from God, why would God call me or call us to ask someone that would just say no? Unless it's a test of some kind. But again, you can rationalize everything. But at this point, I was getting worried. So I got married in the temple, or maybe I'll come back to that one. Okay, because Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Joseph Smith was the first prophet. Brigham Young was his successor. Now, Brigham Young was the prophet that moved the Mormons across the plains and settled in Utah. That's the Brigham Young. Brigham Young is the one that openly practiced polygamy. Now, only recently did the Mormon Church outwardly admit that Joseph Smith also practiced polygamy. And I don't have a problem with polygamy itself amongst consenting people, but the way they used it was really disgusting. And they used it to coerce people. And as I was starting to read some of this history, like not from the church, see, even though I wasn't just going on the internet and saying, I just find a website, I had to have good sources. So I found other scholarly sources that weren't anti-Mormon. They were just scholarly sources about some of these early things going on in the church. And I was really disturbed by it because, again, these were people that I thought were prophets. Now, I didn't think they were infallible, but I had a high expectation about maybe what the behavior of a prophet should be. My bad. And so I thought, where is this new revelation? If this church is built on revelation, where is it? It's not locally in our church. We're just trying to figure stuff out. There wasn't anything added to the Doctrine and Covenants for over 100 years, and that was supposed to be where all the new stuff goes. What I was going to say about temple marriage, was that it had different standards for different parts of the world where you lived. In some places, like for example, when I chose not to get married in the temple, but get married in my local ward instead so my family could be there. Now, like I said, that's my government marriage. I'm not church married yet. I'm not sealed. Celestial married. I had to wait a year as a punishment or whatever. I had to wait a year, a little bit of resentment coming out there, before I could go to the temple and be sealed. In Canada. In England, you could do it on the same day. So again, my thought was, why is this lack of consistency? In a church led by revelation, I thought there would be maybe more consistency. Is that wrong to think? I don't know. So again, it comes back to, where is this new revelation? If we're led by a prophet, where is it? All right. And so at the end of that very first post, this is what I wrote. My goal, honestly, is to know and teach the true doctrine of Christ as taught by the scriptures and latter-day prophets and apostles. I was sincerely seeking, and everyone I know that has left the church, either that I know personally or I've talked to online, this was their goal, was sincere inquiry. Not because they wanted to have a beer, or because they wanted to cheat on their wife, or they're sick of going to church. Now, some people stop going to church because they're sick of going to church, but they still believe. But I was searching for truth. I felt very alienated. You cannot go to Mormon church and bring up this stuff during Sunday school. It's super taboo. It does not happen. So I was like, what? I started feeling uncomfortable going to church. Because I heard people talking about this or that, and I remember thinking, that's not true. I know that Joseph Smith had 32 wives, not just Emma, who we wrote about in the books. And I was like, it disturbed me. So I started feeling alienated. And I was scared because in my church, my former church, marriages often end when one spouse lets go of the faith. That worried me. And I was worried about ostracism by the community. All these things, because this was my community. And because I showed you how busy Mormon life is, that's what you know. And Joseph Smith's polygamy bothered me a lot. He would use it to, he would send men away on missions and marry their wives, even though they were already married. This happened a lot. He would use coercion to marry people's daughters and say, the Lord has revealed to me that I'm supposed to marry your daughter. What do you say when you believe this guy's a prophet and he marries your 14-year-old daughter? So these are things I started finding out. And then I mentioned Joseph Brigham Young's racism. The word of wisdom I discovered wasn't followed by the early church. It came after Prohibition. It's like, oh, what a coincidence that now we don't drink alcohol during Prohibition. Again, it just all led to the modern day revelation not being real. And the prophet said, while I was going to church, that men should have no earrings and women should only have one set of earrings. That was said in general conference when we're supposed to be hearing revelation to guide our lives and the problems going on in the world, and this is what they have for us. I was slightly disappointed. I mean, these are so-called prophets receiving so-called revelation from so-called God, and this is what we were getting. Okay, maybe I had unrealistic expectations. Possible, very possible. But here's the thing, in Doctrine and Covenants, which is one of our scriptures, what I, the Lord, have spoken, I have spoken, and I excuse not myself, whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same. So if the prophet stands up there and says, men are not to wear earrings, it's the same as if God himself is standing there to Mormons. Now, whether Mormons actually believe that or not, there's levels, but that's the doctrine. So if that's the case, then when Prophet A says something and Prophet B says something and there's a contradiction, what do you do? It gets a little confusing. Nails in the coffin. Oh my goodness. The Book of Abraham. This is in the Pearl of Great Price, that thing I had all the stars beside it. Very important. And also Book of Mormon DNA. I'm going to get into both of these, why these were major factors in me leaving the church. The Book of Abraham. The Book of Abraham is a 1835 work produced by Joseph Smith that he said was based on Egyptian papyri purchased from a traveling mummy exhibition. According to Smith, the book was a translation of some ancient records purporting to be the writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus. Smith's translation of the papyri describes the story of Abraham's early life, including the vision of the cosmos. So this traveling exhibition went around and just happened to be the writings of Abraham, the prophet from the Old Testament. So this is what Joseph Smith had in his hands. You see there's portions missing there that he drew in because he's a prophet. He knows what's supposed to be there. Now, the book, this translation, so Joseph Smith Joseph Smith translated this. At the time, hieroglyphics weren't really understood by some dude in America who had no formal education. So, it was written in 1835. The Book of Abraham, written in 1835, that's when he did his translation. Again, hieroglyphics not commonly understood by a 14-year-old farm boy. He wasn't 14 at the time, but that fragment you saw was lost in a fire in 1871, but fragments were found in a museum in 1966, and that's where that scan is from. That scan with his handwriting was found in 1966. I thought, holy shit. If you can take his translation he did in 1835, before hieroglyphics were understood, and now we understand hieroglyphics, and we found the original source Joseph had, if those translation matched, Prophet City, right? So what you see down here, see those numbers, 1, 2, 3, down on the bottom right-hand corner? Joseph Smith numbered those and said what each of them were. Well, sorry to disappoint you. It was not what he said it was. The translations did not match. It's actually something called the Egyptian Book of Breathings or the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The one in the top left there, here's before, here's after. They don't match. Joseph said that this was Abraham on an altar being sacrificed. It's not. It's an Egyptian funerary text up in the top left there, top left. It's commonly understood. We know what it is. They don't match. That's a nail in the coffin for me. Because it's the Book of Breathings. It had nothing to do with Abraham. I won't read through all this. This just shows Joseph Smith's explanation with those numbered items, and then what modern day Egyptologists say it is. I'm going to trust them more. Who do I believe? Do I believe my prophet that I believe is of God, or do I believe modern day scholarship? This is where I was at. So the cognitive dissonance was in kick very high during this period. If he made it up, then he probably made up the Book of Mormon, because it was translated by the same power, except we didn't have the source for the Book of Mormon. Those golden plates, the angel Moroni took it back to heaven. So we didn't have it, conveniently enough. So maybe everything is made up. And then I thought, if everything's made up, there is no modern day revelation, there is no authority, there's no church. Now, Book of Mormon DNA is the second nail in the coffin. Because this is what it says on the title page of the Book of Mormon. The book was written by many ancient prophets by the spirit of prophecy and revelation. The record gives an account of the two great civilizations. One came from Jerusalem. After thousands of years, all were destroyed except the Lamanites. And they are the principal ancestors of the American Indians. So the Book of Mormon talks about people that are the principal ancestors of modern day Aboriginal people. This has been changed in recent years, by the way. Once the DNA research came out, they changed this title page. So it didn't match. It's a testable claim. If they are the descendants, if modern Aboriginal people are the descendants of the people of the Book of Mormon who are Hebrew, there should be some evidence there. That's another. So the Book of Abraham was a testable claim. That's the problem with having a church only a couple hundred years old, because you have material you can work from. So it's a testable claim. And so in the late 1990s, genetic testing was done on all sorts of Aboriginal communities in North America. And surprise, surprise, not from Jerusalem. So there's no trace of Hebrew DNA in modern day Aboriginals. So, why I left. I read the apologetics to try to deal with this stuff. But I stopped believing that the church was true. I didn't feel it anymore. All at the same time, it's kind of like a nice cluster, because at the same time I was learning about skepticism and the baloney detection kit. I discovered the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. Oh my goodness. I started learning about science and how you know what's true. How can you know what's really true? That was my question. If not the prophet, then how do I know? So I started learning about logical fallacies and science and how we know that science is reliable. Oh, and those demons that I thought were trying to invade my body is sleep paralysis. I started learning about the brain and what sleep paralysis is. I just had a brain thing going on where it's common. People see visions and they wake up paralyzed and they see visions of ghosts and demons or aliens or whatever it is that their world is around. And so I started learning all these all at the same time. My eyes became open to reality. Oh, I also started learning magic at the same time. I learned how easy it is to fool people and to fool yourself. My goodness, this was all happening at the same time. So my eyes became opened. And so I thought, could I go to church as a non-believer? I couldn't do it. I stopped going to church within 4 months of all of this going on because I felt like a hypocrite going there. I thought I could just go for the community or just to support my wife and kids. Couldn't do it. The prophets, then Jesus, or then the church, then Jesus, then God. It all fell apart. It's hard to learn that everything you believe is wrong. None of it held up to any standard of evidence, and I left. So where am I? That should not be in there. Okay, I'm not a member on paper. Sorry, I should remove that. And I mentioned she asked me not to resign just in case. Proposition 8 was the church took a stand on this California an effort to ban gay marriage, and that really left a bad taste in my mouth because the church was supporting it. Even though I wasn't going to church anymore, I was still a member on paper. It made me want to leave. So I officially resigned a few months after my marriage ended. And where am I now? I've embraced science, yay. But I have a different standard of evidence for everything in life. I've embraced secular values. I'm an agnostic atheist. That's how I describe myself. And the need for education. I teach my kids about the scientific process. I don't bash church to them. I just tell them, I want them to understand how to know what's real and what's not. And I have a lot of proselytizing to make up for. So which is why I like to do science advocacy, be involved when I can and do things like this. Thank you very much. And I think we have a couple minutes for questions. 5 minutes for questions. Hammer. Oh, thank you.
How do you get to be a prophet? And in the process, is there any shenanigans? As in, I guess we'd call it politicking or super PACing or any of that sort of thing. Not that I want to become a prophet. It all depends. How do you become a prophet?
It's a simple process. Joseph Smith was ordained by James Peter, guys from the Old Testament, who appeared in person and put his hands on his head and said, now you're a prophet. Of course, I'm saying that like this. But that he became the first prophet ordained. Now, from there, modern day is just whoever the most senior apostle is. So if you're called to be an apostle, so you're one of the 12 apostles, whoever's the senior apostle. So when the prophet dies, whoever's been an apostle the longest becomes prophet. That's...
Okay, before you go, those guys that helped you move, can I get that phone number?
Oh, yeah. Okay. They're handy guys. Yes.
Can a woman be a prophet?
No.
So does anybody leave because that's also a great big pile of bullshit?
Yeah, women.
Like why are there, why aren't there people that just say, I thank you for sharing why you left, but are there not people that go, this is just a great big pile of merde? Why?
Yeah, I'll explain. Only males have the priesthood, so only if you can only be a prophet if you have the priesthood. So there has been a movement recently in Mormonism for sort of women to not necessarily have the priesthood, but to it sucks. It's just how it is. Yeah, shorthand. Just you can't have the priesthood if you're a female. I could have rationalized it before, but I'm not going to even try now. They just don't get to. Sorry.
So you had said that hell is not part of the Mormon doctrine,
Sure.
and I understand that it's not part of the teaching.
Yeah.
And yet I've spoken with a number of ex-Mormons who say that they were taught about hell growing up and that this was part of how they were indoctrinated and made to be afraid to leave the church. So I'm not sure how to phrase this as a question. What's that about?
Sure. Outer darkness that I kind of mentioned before, which is a place where only the worst of the worst go. If you, like for myself, a Mormon would consider me having be now an ex-Mormon, I wouldn't go the highest level of heaven. There's 3 levels of heaven: celestial, telestial, and terrestrial. I only get to the terrestrial because I'm an ex-Mormon. And also with all the rapists and murderers, I go with them. Yeah, so there's different levels. So that could be considered like a hell.
Is that where the beer drinkers go?
Absolutely. Yes. Okay, one more.
Could you elaborate on the attitude toward black
Sure.
people?
Sure, and from what I understand about it was that it extended from Brigham Young, who, reading the scriptures, felt inspired that said people, in the Old Testament, descendants of Cain, Ham and Cain, I might have that wrong, which were, he decided, as the years went, the doctrines changed, where if you were black but from Samoa, you could have the priesthood, but it was African blacks that couldn't have the priesthood because they were descendants of the line of Ham. And there was a curse, Ham's curse, back in the Old Testament, and they decided this is what it is. And it wasn't until 1978 that a revelation happened where they decided to give the priesthood to everyone amongst all sorts of social pressures that they were having. But not women, no. All males.
They're still called to the kitchen.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, folks. Thank you.
Very well done.
Thank you.
Awesome.